All right, so I want to ask you this thing. So, see, because usually your opinion is so, I won't use the word harsh, but I mean, objective and straightforward. So every time you praise something, it comes to my notice, like outright praise. And you have said this, I think, 2 or 3 times that Moby-Dick is a novel of universal significance for
I think.
starters. That's what you've said.
Mhm.
So why? I mean, why Moby-Dick? Is it because I mean it's huge, right? It's big. It's the
Well,
size of the novel.
it's about 215,000 words. So it's a
Yeah.
larger novel, probably about 550 to 600 pages in typical font. But I mean, if it was published today, it would still be a great novel. There are things that if they came out today and they didn't have a famous name to attach to them, they wouldn't. For example, a lot of the works of Shakespeare simply don't hold up. And there are
Yeah.
people
Oh
who
yeah.
think the English language that Shakespeare is the greatest thing ever. There's no doubt that Shakespeare wrote some great stuff. I would say he probably has a handful to maybe a dozen sonnets that are still great. His long poems have always sucked. His comedies have always been rabidly unfunny. Um,
Uh,
and I would say he has 7 or 8 plays. You could maybe argue a dozen that are great, but they're a limited form of greatness because just like the Greeks before him, he expounded and expanded what the Greeks did. The modernists have expanded and expounded on what Shakespeare did, and that's what
oh
I
yeah.
am doing in my plays. Is I'm going far beyond this melodrama thing. But as far as Moby Dick, uh, it's a very bold novel in the way it uses things. There were novels that I don't know if you've ever read the Tristram Shandy. It's a long
Yeah,
novel.
I have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Shandy is one of those novels that's an important book and it has great moments in it. But if it was published today, would it be considered great? 50-50. The reason Moby Dick goes farther and deeper is that number one, it presented more real people. Novels before Melville and before a lot of the people that came in the early to mid 19th century, especially in the English language, tended
Yeah.
to present the royals, people of wealth, people of means. Why do you think most of all Shakespeare focuses on kings? And the few times he focuses on the average person, they're objects of ridicule. They're bumbling thieves or idiots or they're slobs or they're fools.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Yeah.
even if you look at something like The Tale of Genji, which is a novel from Japan, Lady Murakami, um, that tends to be quote unquote what we might now call an elitist view of the world. That's not to say that the elites don't have a right to have the view, but if you look at Moby Dick, putting aside, I mean, it has the metaphorical content that it has so many different people. You have black people, you have white people, you have possible homosexuals, you have South Pacific Islanders, you have religious people, you have the crazy man in Ahab, you have the little black boy who's his assistant. There's this wide. I mean, there's no women other than in the beginning
Yeah.
and you were there, but there's this wide array of that you didn't see in other novels. If you saw a black person in a novel published in America before Moby Dick, he was a shuffling fool. He was what we call here a house goon. He'd be like Yaza Masa, Yaza. But if you look at the characters there, the black people, the few black characters are just as important. They're normal people. So Moby Dick is important, and it shows some of its greatness in its very straightforward portrayal of people. Then there's the actual story. Well, let me just get to the metaphor before I get to the story. A lot of people have made some good points that Moby Dick also, because at the time I think there were 31 or 32 states in the United States at the time it was published. There's 31 or 32 people on the boat, the Pequod, so that each of them represents one of the states. And I remember reading a long analysis of this and whatnot. I don't know how true it is, but it's an interesting point. So there's a political metaphor to it. There's also again, now the plot is we what is it? On the surface level, it's about a crazy man going after this quote unquote monster, but Moby Dick is just an animal. Maybe because it's a whale, it's a smarter animal than if it had been a giant shark. But Moby Dick becomes this thing, this what we call a desideratum. Ahab has to have Moby Dick's blood on his hand, and it's based on a real incident too, which is another thing. Is that it's one of the first what we call based on a true story kind of novel that really is great that I know of. I mean, you know, Tristram Shandy is made up. Robinson Crusoe is totally made up, although there were people known to have been stranded on islands. The bulk of Robinson Crusoe is totally made up. And it's not as heavy-handed as other things. People will point to some things like the chapters that go on about you know, the whaling industry or the scientific background, but these are things that give you, they work partly because they give you a pause from the narrative. You know, imagine it's sort of like having a bathroom break if you're watching Satan Tango, a 7.5-hour film by Bellatar. You know, if you have to go to the bathroom 3 hours in, it's sort of like reading one of those chapters. But a lot of the chapters too, though, while they would be called intercalary chapters being inserted in, some of them have some of the best moments in there. There's probably the chapter that's always stuck with me, I think, is called the Grand Armada, in which we're up in the crow's nest with one of the sailors, and he's looking down, and the water is so clear around this island or wherever they are that he can see the whales below the surface, and he can see mother whales and the babies suckling on the mother, and the description is so beautiful and whatnot, and it has a larger metaphoric content, it has a more poetic content, and it brings you out, and the ability to go high and low in Melville is not as forced as, say, it is in Shakespeare. If you look at a lot of Shakespeare stuff, like King Lear, I think is a very overrated play. I don't think it's a bad play, but I don't think it's a great play. And the fact that you have the old man wandering on the heath and he's been betrayed by his daughters, and there's a lot of it that we've seen before and seen since, and some of it has been better. Moby-Dick, in a sense, while people have used the chase and the person going crazy and trying to get revenge about something, The Wrath of Khan, you know, the Star Trek movie is an obvious example. It's never been done better, and I think 160 years plus on, or not even 170, it was 1851, so almost 170 years on. It's something that's still, if it had been just discovered today in a footlocker and published, and someone said there was this guy named Melville, well, remember Melville who wrote all those pretty good novels and what? Well, here's something that he wrote that he never published. It would be a revelation, it would be a literary find today. So, and I could go on if I had the book and whatnot, but those are the top 4 or 5 reasons.